James Warren stood by his office window, staring blankly at the bustling streets of Chicago below. The people seemed so distant, like blurred figures in a photograph. It was midday, but the heavy rain clouds painted everything in a dull gray, mirroring the void he felt inside. For years, James had maintained a routine that kept him busy and distracted, filling every moment with work and philanthropic projects. He was known as a generous man, often funding shelters, schools, and orphanages, yet very few truly knew the depth of his sorrow. His once warm and inviting eyes were now cold and tired, marked by dark circles that told stories of sleepless nights and untamed grief. There were days when his son's laughter would echo in his mind, clear, innocent, full of life. The boy's name was Daniel, barely 2 years old when he vanished without a trace. James still remembered that morning vividly, the panic that surged through him when he realized Daniel wasn't in his crib. Every search, every lead, every hope had eventually led to dead ends. The agony had not just scarred him, it had reshaped him. "Mr. Warren?" A hesitant voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Linda, his assistant, holding a stack of papers. Her presence brought him back to reality. James turned slowly, his gaze steady but hollow. "Yes, Linda? You have a meeting with the board in an hour. I thought I'd remind you," she said softly, trying to gauge his mood. She had seen him in this state before. A distant, almost trance-like silence that would often settle over him, especially on rainy days. "Thank you, Linda. I'll be there," he replied, his voice low but composed. She lingered for a moment, then nodded and left, closing the door gently behind her. James sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. He wasn't just a father who had lost his son. He was a man trapped in an unending cycle of guilt and torment. Every street corner, every playground, every child he saw seemed to be a reminder of what he had lost. As he prepared himself for the board meeting, his mind drifted back to a time when he used to read stories to Daniel every night. In one flashback, he could see the boy's tiny fingers reaching out to touch the pages, his eyes wide with wonder. He'd often ask, "Daddy, can I be the hero one day?" It was a simple question, one that still stabbed at James's heart. He had failed to be the hero Daniel needed. Later that evening, after the meeting, James decided to visit one of the shelters he funded regularly. It was one of the few things that brought him some solace, helping those who had no one else. The shelter was crowded that night, filled with people seeking warmth from the rain that pounded mercilessly against the windows. As James walked inside, he noticed a commotion near the back door. A boy, no older than 12, was trying to slip away with a loaf of bread tucked under his oversized jacket. He was skinny, with dirt-streaked cheeks and eyes that were sharp, yet weary beyond his years. "Hey!" shouted one of the staff members, running after the boy. But James raised a hand, stopping him. "I'll handle this," he said calmly, his curiosity piqued. James approached the boy slowly, hands open, showing he meant no harm. "What's your name?" he asked. The boy hesitated, his eyes darting from James to the exit. "Lucas," he muttered, gripping the loaf tighter, ready to bolt if needed. "Lucas, stealing isn't the answer," James said gently. "If you're hungry, you don't need to run away. Let's talk." Lucas narrowed his eyes, suspicion evident in his posture. "People like you only help when it's convenient," he shot back, his voice rough and defensive. James remained calm, though Lucas's words stung. "Maybe you're right," James conceded. "But that doesn't mean I don't want to help now." Lucas didn't move, but there was a flicker of doubt in his gaze. James took a small step closer, still keeping his tone gentle. "How long has it been since you've had a proper meal?" The boy's shoulders slumped slightly, and for the first time, James saw vulnerability beneath the tough exterior. 2 days, Lucas admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Then let's fix that," James replied. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small bundle of bills. "Get yourself something to eat, but next time, just ask." Lucas stared at the money, then at James. "Why do you care?" he asked, a mix of curiosity and defiance in his tone. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," James said quietly. The words carried a weight that Lucas could sense, though he couldn't yet understand. Lucas hesitated for a moment longer, then grabbed the money and turned to leave. But before he could disappear into the night, James called after him. "If you need a place to stay, come back here. I'll make sure you have a bed." Lucas didn't respond, but there was a moment, a brief pause, before he vanished into the rain. As James watched the boy run off, he felt an inexplicable connection, something that stirred a long-buried hope within him. There was something about Lucas's defiant spirit that reminded him of Daniel. And for the first time in years, James felt the faintest glimmer of a possibility. Maybe, just maybe, life had more to offer than endless grief. The rain continued to pour, but James felt a subtle shift within, a seed of hope beginning to take root in the midst of his pain. The encounter with Lucas had awakened something in him, something that he wasn't ready to fully acknowledge yet, but he knew this was just the beginning. The rain had stopped by the next morning, but the sky remained heavy, overcast with lingering clouds. James stood at the window again, sipping his coffee absent-mindedly. His mind was still on Lucas, the street boy with the piercing eyes who seemed both vulnerable and fiercely independent. There was something familiar about him. Perhaps it was his defiant gaze or his unwillingness to accept help without a fight. James couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen those eyes before, and the thought haunted him throughout the day. Later that afternoon, James returned to the same shelter, feeling a strange pull. He wasn't sure if Lucas would show up again, but a part of him hoped he would. The shelter was quieter this time, with fewer people milling about. James kept to himself, watching the entrance from a distance. Hours passed, and James was about to leave when a sudden movement near the back entrance caught his eye. It was Lucas, his clothes still damp from the previous night's rain, his eyes scanning the room like a wary animal assessing potential threats. He looked thinner in the daylight, his cheeks hollow and his skin pale. James approached him slowly, making sure not to startle him. "Lucas," he called softly. Lucas spun around, surprise flashing across his face. He hadn't expected James to be there. "You again?" he muttered, trying to maintain his tough demeanor. James offered a small smile. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," he admitted. "But I'm glad you did." Lucas shrugged, still keeping a safe distance. "I didn't come back for you," he said flatly. "I came for food." "Fair enough," James replied. "But if you're willing, I'd like to offer more than just a meal. There's a place not far from here. A temporary shelter where you can get a bed, a shower, and some clean clothes." Lucas's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "And what do you want in return?" he demanded. "Nothing," James said simply. "Just a chance for you to rest for a while." Lucas stared at James, trying to read his intentions. There was a pause before he spoke again. "Why do you even care?" he asked, this time with a mix of genuine curiosity and lingering distrust. James's expression softened. "Because I lost someone once," he admitted, "and I couldn't help him. But maybe I can help you." Lucas seemed taken aback by the honesty in James's words. He hesitated, then asked, "Is that why you keep coming back here? Because of your lost person?" James nodded slowly. "Yes," he said quietly, "but that's not the only reason. I come back because everyone deserves a chance, no matter what they've been through." Lucas looked away, uncomfortable with the sincerity. He didn't respond, but his shoulders relaxed slightly, a small sign of trust beginning to form. "Let's get you something to eat first," James suggested, trying to ease the tension. "Then we can talk about the shelter." Lucas didn't protest this time. He followed James to the kitchen, where a volunteer handed him a plate of warm food. Lucas ate quickly, shoveling the food into his mouth like he hadn't eaten properly in days. James watched silently, feeling a mix of pity and a strange, protective instinct. After the meal, James led Lucas outside. "The shelter isn't far," he explained as they walked. Lucas kept pace, though he maintained a cautious distance. The temporary shelter was a modest building, clean but worn down by years of use. James greeted the staff, then turned to Lucas. "You'll have your own space here," he said. "No one will bother you." Lucas looked skeptical but intrigued. "What if I don't like it?" he asked. "Then you're free to leave," James assured him. "No one will stop you." Lucas seemed to consider this for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "I'll stay for now," he muttered. As they approached the entrance, Lucas suddenly stopped, a flash of hesitation in his eyes. "What if this is a mistake?" he asked quietly, more to himself than to James. James placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder, offering a rare gesture of warmth. "It's not a mistake," he said firmly. "It's a chance. And that's all we need sometimes." Lucas glanced up at James, and for a brief moment, James saw a flicker of hope in the boy's eyes. It was faint, but it was there. Over the next few days, Lucas remained cautious, always keeping his guard up. But as time passed, he started to open up, bit by bit. His defenses, once impenetrable, began to show cracks. One evening, as they sat on the steps of the shelter, Lucas shared a small part of his past. "I grew up in foster homes," he said suddenly, his voice low and hesitant. "Got passed around a lot. No one really wanted to keep me." James listened, his heart heavy with a mix of empathy and a familiar pain. "That must have been hard," he said softly. Lucas shrugged, trying to appear indifferent. "I'm used to it," he replied. "People always leave." "Not everyone," James said, his voice steady. "Some people stay, no matter what." Lucas didn't respond, but James could see that his words had made an impact. The boy's expression softened, even if just for a moment. A few nights later, as Lucas was preparing to sleep, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished medallion. He stared at it for a long time, his face unreadable. James, passing by, noticed the medallion and stopped in his tracks. It was old and worn, but there was something unmistakable about it. "Where did you get that?" James asked, his voice tense. Lucas's eyes darted up, his grip tightening around the medallion. "It's mine," he said defensively. "I've had it for as long as I can remember." James's heart raced, a mixture of disbelief and hope surging through him. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on the medallion. "May I see it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lucas hesitated, then handed it over reluctantly. James's hands trembled as he examined the medallion. It was the same one he had given to Daniel, his son, just days before he was taken. The initials, faintly engraved on the back, were still visible. James felt a rush of emotions, hope, fear, and a deep, aching uncertainty. He handed the medallion back to Lucas, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's a beautiful piece," he said, his mind racing with possibilities. Lucas seemed confused by James's reaction. "Why does it matter so much to you?" he asked, a hint of suspicion returning. James forced a smile, though his heart was pounding. It reminded me of someone I lost," he said carefully. Lucas studied James for a moment, his eyes searching for the truth. "Is that why you're helping me?" he asked. "Yes," James answered honestly. "But it's not the only reason." Lucas looked away, seemingly unsure of how to process James's words. But there was a shift, a subtle, unspoken connection between them, one that neither fully understood yet. As James watched Lucas retreat to his room, the weight of the discovery pressed heavily on him. Could Lucas really be his son? The possibility was almost too much to bear. But for the first time in years, there was a chance, a fragile, terrifying chance, that he might find the answers he had been searching for. The days that followed were marked by a growing, yet cautious bond between James and Lucas. Though Lucas remained distant, there were moments when his defenses seemed to lower just enough for glimpses of vulnerability to show. James, on the other hand, found himself increasingly drawn to the boy, not just out of a sense of duty, but something deeper, more instinctual. One chilly afternoon, as they sat side by side on the steps of the shelter, Lucas seemed more at ease than usual. He stared absently at the worn laces of his sneakers before breaking the silence. "Why do you keep coming back here?" he asked bluntly. James paused, surprised by the sudden question. "I think you already know," he replied softly. Lucas turned to look at him, his gaze steady and searching. "You think I'm your son, don't you?" he asked. The directness of the question caught James off guard. He took a deep breath, his voice filled with sincerity. "I don't know for sure," he admitted, "but there are moments, things you say, the way you move. It reminds me of him." Lucas seemed unfazed by the answer, as if he had expected it. "People say I look like a lot of folks," he said with a shrug, trying to dismiss the gravity of the situation. James nodded slowly, acknowledging the boy's skepticism. "I understand if you don't believe me," he said. But if there's even a small chance that you are my son, I have to try. Lucas's eyes flickered with uncertainty. What if you're wrong? He asked quietly. Then at least I'll know I tried, James answered, his voice firm but filled with a lingering sadness. The conversation hung heavily between them, each word wrapped in a complex mix of hope and doubt. For Lucas, the idea of having a real family seemed too distant, too far-fetched. And for James, it was a chance he couldn't afford to let slip away. Over the next week, their conversations grew deeper. Lucas, still wary, began to share fragments of his past, though he was careful to keep certain details vague. James listened attentively, never pushing too hard, knowing that trust was a fragile thing. One evening, as they were sitting in the common room of the shelter, Lucas picked up a worn deck of cards from a nearby table. "Ever play?" he asked, holding up the cards. James smiled. "It's been a while," he confessed. Lucas started shuffling the deck, his fingers moving deftly. "I used to play with this old guy at one of the foster homes," he said, his tone almost casual. "He wasn't very good, but he taught me the basics." James watched Lucas deal the cards with surprising skill. "What was his name?" he asked gently. Lucas hesitated. "Henry," he said after a moment. "He was the closest thing to a family I had for a while." There was a rawness in Lucas's voice, a hint of vulnerability that made James's chest tighten. "I'm glad you had someone like that," James said sincerely. "Yeah," Lucas replied, his eyes focused on the cards. "But he died a couple of years ago." The words hung in the air, a reminder of the many losses Lucas had endured in his short life. James reached out, placing a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Lucas stiffened at the contact but didn't pull away. "It's fine," he muttered. "People leave. It's just how it is." James's heart ached at the boy's resigned tone. "Not everyone leaves," he said firmly. "Some people stay, no matter what." Lucas glanced up, meeting James's gaze with a mix of skepticism and something close to hope. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough to keep James going. A few nights later, something unexpected happened. Lucas had been restless all day, pacing the shelter with an unusual energy. James noticed but didn't press him, waiting for Lucas to open up in his own time. Finally, as they sat down for dinner, Lucas blurted out, "I had a dream last night." James looked up, intrigued. "What was it about?" Lucas hesitated, then spoke slowly, as if testing the waters. "I was in a park," he said. "It was sunny, and I was with someone. A man. He was laughing, and I felt happy. Really happy." James listened intently, sensing the importance of what Lucas was sharing. "Did you recognize the man?" he asked gently. Lucas shook his head, frustration evident in his voice. "No," he said, "but it felt familiar, like I was supposed to know him." James's heart raced at the description. It sounded eerily similar to a memory he had of taking Daniel to the park on sunny afternoons, playing and laughing together. But he kept his voice steady, not wanting to influence Lucas's memories. "Maybe it was just a dream," he said cautiously. "But sometimes dreams can be more than that." Lucas looked unsure, his brow furrowed in thought. "I don't know," he admitted, "but it felt real." James didn't push further, knowing that Lucas needed time to process his feelings. But the revelation lingered in his mind, a haunting possibility that refused to let go. A few days later, as James and Lucas walked to a nearby diner for breakfast, Lucas suddenly stopped in front of a storefront window. "Look," he said, pointing to a poster on the wall. It was an advertisement for a missing children's foundation, one that James had helped fund years ago. Lucas stared at the faces of the missing children, his expression unreadable. "Do you think their families ever stop looking for them?" he asked, his voice barely audible. James's throat tightened. "No," he said firmly. "They never stop." Lucas seemed to be lost in thought, his eyes fixed on the poster. "I don't remember much about when I was little," he confessed. "Just bits and pieces." James's heart ached at the boy's admission. "It's okay," he reassured him. "You don't have to remember everything. What matters is that you're here now." Lucas nodded slowly, as if trying to accept the words. "I just wish I knew," he said softly. James felt a surge of determination. "We'll find out," he promised. One way or another, we'll find the answers. That night, as Lucas settled into bed at the shelter, James lingered at the doorway. "Good night, Lucas," he said, his voice filled with a tenderness he hadn't felt in years. Lucas turned over, his face half buried in the pillow. "Good night," he mumbled, a hint of warmth in his voice. As James walked away, he felt a mixture of hope and fear. The connection between them was growing stronger, but so was the uncertainty. Each moment brought them closer to a truth that could either heal or break them both. For now, James was willing to embrace the unknown, driven by the faint but undeniable possibility that Lucas might truly be the son he had lost. One cold morning, as James was getting ready to leave for the shelter, he received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was a woman's, unfamiliar but urgent. "Mr. Warren? This is Nancy from the Child Services office. We've come across some information that might be related to Lucas. I thought you should know." James's grip on the phone tightened. "What kind of information?" Nancy hesitated before continuing. "It's about a child reported missing years ago, around the same time as your son, Daniel. The case was never closed, but we've recently linked some records from the foster care system that mention a boy with a similar background to Lucas's." The air seemed to thicken around James, his pulse quickening with both hope and fear. "Do you have any concrete evidence?" he asked cautiously, not wanting to raise his hopes too high. "Not yet," Nancy admitted, "but we're working on retrieving the files, and we may be able to confirm a few things within the next few weeks." James thanked her and hung up, his mind reeling with possibilities. If there was even a small chance that Lucas was indeed Daniel, then he needed to act. He needed to be sure. But there was also a sense of dread. What if this lead turned out to be another dead end? At the shelter, Lucas was sitting at the kitchen table, munching on a bowl of cereal. He looked up as James entered, sensing the tension in the older man's face. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice casual but his eyes wary. "Nothing you need to worry about," James replied with a forced smile. "Just a work call." Lucas wasn't convinced but didn't press further. He was used to keeping secrets and had learned not to pry. Over the next few days, James found it harder to maintain his composure around Lucas. Every little detail, the boy's mannerisms, his expressions, even the way he laughed, seemed to add more weight to the possibility that Lucas could be his son. He tried not to let his growing hope show, afraid of both the boy's reaction and his own potential disappointment. One evening, as they sat together in the shelter's small living area, Lucas suddenly turned to James with a serious expression. "Why are you so interested in me?" he asked bluntly. "I mean, I know you're trying to help, but it feels like there's more to it." James met Lucas's gaze, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Because I see something in you," he admitted. "Something that reminds me of someone I lost." Lucas looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting to the floor. "You mean your son?" he said quietly. "Yes," James answered honestly. "And I don't expect you to understand, but there's a part of me that needs to know. If you're him." Lucas seemed to struggle with the weight of the conversation. "What if I'm not?" he asked, a trace of vulnerability in his voice. James leaned forward, his eyes filled with sincerity. "Then it won't change how I feel. I want to help you, Lucas, no matter what." Lucas's face softened, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might let down his guard. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the vulnerability was replaced by his usual defensiveness. "I don't need anyone to save me," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'm not trying to save you," James replied gently. "I just want to be here, if you'll let me." The following week brought a new turn of events. Lucas was rummaging through an old bag he'd brought with him when he first arrived at the shelter. Among the few possessions he had, he pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, its edges frayed and worn. "What's that?" James asked curiously, noticing the paper. Lucas hesitated, then handed it over reluctantly. "It's just some stuff I kept from a long time ago." James unfolded the paper carefully. It was a faded sketch of a tree, drawn with the unsteady lines of a child's hand. But there was something about it that felt familiar, too familiar. His mind raced as he recognized the rough lines, the jagged branches. It was the same tree he used to draw with Daniel during their trips to the park. He remembered how Daniel had been fascinated by one particular tree, always insisting they included in their drawings. "Where did you get this?" James asked, his voice shaky. Lucas shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "I don't know. I've had it for as long as I can remember." James felt his throat tighten. "Did someone draw this with you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Lucas shook his head. "I don't remember," he said simply, as if the answer didn't matter. But to James, it did matter, more than anything. This small, seemingly insignificant sketch felt like a missing piece of a puzzle he had been trying to solve for years. That night, James lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Every detail, every interaction with Lucas replayed in his mind. There was a growing certainty within him, a gut feeling that Lucas was more than just a lost boy. He was the lost boy. He thought of the medallion, the sketch, and the strange feeling of familiarity that lingered between them. The next day, James made a decision. He approached Lucas as the boy was getting ready to leave for school. "Lucas, can we talk for a moment?" he asked, his voice firm but gentle. Lucas looked hesitant, sensing the seriousness of the conversation. "What is it?" he asked warily. James took a deep breath. "I want to do a DNA test," he said, "to know for sure." Lucas's reaction was immediate. His eyes widened with shock, followed by a wave of anger. "Why? So you can prove I'm not your son and just forget about me?" he snapped. James shook his head, his expression earnest. "No, Lucas. I need to know the truth, for both of us. If you're not my son, I'll still be here. But if you are, I don't want to waste any more time not knowing." Lucas seemed torn, his emotions battling beneath the surface. "And what if I don't want to do it?" he asked defiantly. "Then I won't force you," James replied. "But I'm asking you to consider it. For your own sake, too." Lucas turned away, his shoulders tense. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice low. James nodded, respecting the boy's need for space. "That's all I ask," he said softly. Over the next few days, Lucas remained distant, avoiding prolonged conversations with James. It was clear that the idea of the DNA test had unsettled him deeply. But James didn't press him, knowing that the boy needed time to process the request. Then, one evening, as James was preparing to leave the shelter, Lucas appeared in the doorway. "I'll do it," he said abruptly, his voice barely audible. James looked up, a mixture of relief and anxiety in his eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked gently. Lucas nodded, though he looked scared. "Yeah," he said, "but only because I want to know, too." The next morning, they went to a clinic together. The process was quick, but the atmosphere was tense, filled with a heavy silence. As they left the clinic, Lucas seemed drained, his steps slow and uncertain. "Whatever the results are, you'll be okay," James reassured him. Lucas looked up, his eyes filled with fear. "What if I'm not?" he whispered. James's heart broke at the vulnerability in Lucas's voice. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. "Then I'll be here to help you," he promised. The waiting began, each day filled with a mix of hope, fear, and countless unanswered questions. For both James and Lucas, the approaching truth felt both terrifying and necessary, a step that could either break them or finally bring them together. The days stretched on painfully as James and Lucas awaited the DNA results. Each morning, James would sit by the phone, hoping it would ring, while Lucas seemed to retreat further into himself. The anticipation weighed heavily, as if every conversation, every glance, carried the burden of the answer they were about to receive. Lucas's behavior shifted noticeably. He became withdrawn, his usual defiant energy replaced by a restless anxiety. One evening, as they sat together in the shelter's small living room, Lucas finally spoke up. "I hate waiting," he muttered, staring at the floor. James glanced at him, his voice gentle. "I know. It's hard for me, too." Lucas looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of frustration and fear. "What if I'm not him?" he blurted out. "What happens then?" James felt a lump in his throat, but he spoke with unwavering sincerity. "Then we keep going," he said. "We figure it out together." The words seemed to offer some comfort, though Lucas remained guarded. "I've never had anyone who wanted to figure things out with me," he admitted quietly. James's heart ached at the boy's words. "You have that now," he promised. no matter what. As the days passed, James noticed small changes in Lucas. The boy's defensive wall seemed to lower, bit by bit. He started to share more stories, some about the foster homes, others about the streets. It was clear that Lucas had lived a life filled with instability and betrayal, making it difficult for him to trust anyone, including James. One afternoon, as they were walking back from the grocery store, Lucas suddenly asked, "Why did you give up looking for your son?" James stopped in his tracks, caught off guard by the question. "I never really stopped," he said slowly. "But after years of dead ends, it felt like I was losing myself." Lucas seemed to absorb the answer, his gaze thoughtful. "Do you think he's still out there?" he asked, his voice softer now. James looked straight ahead, his eyes distant. "I've always hoped he was," he admitted. "But I also learned that hoping too much can be dangerous. It can break you." Lucas nodded, understanding more than James realized. "I get that," he said simply. Then, one morning, the call finally came. James's heart pounded as he answered, his voice shaky with anticipation. "Yes, this is James Warren." Nancy's voice was calm but serious on the other end. "Mr. Warren, we have the DNA results." James's grip tightened on the phone. "And?" There was a brief pause, then Nancy spoke clearly. "The results are a match. Lucas is your son." The words hit James like a wave, a flood of relief, disbelief, and overwhelming emotion all at once. He struggled to find his voice. "Are you sure?" he asked, barely able to contain the tremble in his tone. "Yes, Mr. Warren. The DNA is a match," Nancy confirmed. James felt tears welling up in his eyes, a mix of joy and sorrow. "Thank you," he managed to say before hanging up. Lucas was sitting across the room, watching James with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. James turned to him, his voice thick with emotion. "Lucas, you're my son." Lucas's face went pale, his eyes wide with shock. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. James nodded, unable to hold back his tears any longer. "Yes, it's true. The test confirmed it." Lucas seemed to struggle with the news, his emotions a chaotic swirl of disbelief, fear, and something close to hope. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice raw. "It means I found you," James said simply, "and I'm not losing you again." Lucas's eyes filled with tears, but he quickly wiped them away, trying to maintain his composure. "I don't know how to feel," he confessed. "I've been alone for so long. I don't know how to be someone's son." James stepped closer, his voice filled with tenderness. "We'll figure it out, one day at a time. We don't have to rush anything." Lucas looked down, his hands trembling. I thought I didn't matter," he said, his voice breaking. James's heart shattered at the boy's words. "You matter to me," he said firmly. "You always have." Lucas seemed to crumble under the weight of the revelation, and for the first time, he allowed himself to cry openly. James pulled him into a tight embrace, holding him as if he were afraid to let go. Lucas clung to him, sobbing uncontrollably, all the years of pain and abandonment pouring out in a flood of raw emotion. "It's okay," James whispered. "You're safe now." Lucas didn't respond, but his grip tightened, as if he were afraid that this moment of safety might vanish. They stayed like that for a long time, both of them allowing the long-held pain to finally surface and begin to heal. In the following days, life at the shelter seemed different. Lucas was no longer just another lost boy. He was James's son, and the staff treated him with a newfound sense of warmth. But the transition wasn't easy. Lucas struggled to accept the reality of his new life, often feeling torn between the streets he had known for so long and the promise of a stable home. One night, as they sat on the steps of the shelter, Lucas spoke up. "Do you think I'll ever feel normal?" he asked, his voice small. James turned to him, his expression sincere. "I think normal is different for everyone," he said, "but I do know that you'll feel loved. That's a promise." Lucas seemed to consider this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'd like that," he said quietly. The next morning, James began making arrangements to take Lucas home. It was a bittersweet moment. While Lucas was relieved to leave the shelter, he was also hesitant about entering a world that felt both foreign and frightening. As they packed Lucas's few belongings, he found the sketch of the tree again. He held it up to James, his expression unreadable. "Do you remember this?" he asked. James's eyes softened. "I do," he said. "We used to draw that tree all the time." Lucas looked down at the sketch, a mixture of nostalgia and sadness in his gaze. "I guess I did remember some things," he said. "You remembered the most important things," James replied, his voice filled with emotion. "And that's what matters." They left the shelter together, stepping into a world that was both uncertain and full of possibilities. As they walked down the street, James placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder, a silent promise that this time he would not let go. Lucas looked up at him, a hesitant smile forming on his face. "So, what happens now?" he asked. James smiled back, his eyes filled with hope. "We start over," he said simply. "As a family." James and Lucas arrived at James's home in the early evening. It was a modest two-story house in the suburbs, filled with signs of a life paused and waiting to be resumed. The porch light flickered gently, casting a warm glow over the front steps as James fumbled with the keys. "Welcome home," James said softly, pushing the door open. He tried to keep his voice steady, but his words carried a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Lucas stepped inside cautiously, his eyes darting around as if unsure of his place in this new reality. The house had an inviting air. A living room with soft, worn furniture, a kitchen that smelled faintly of spices, and a few family photos on the walls. Lucas noticed one picture in particular, a younger James with a woman and a small boy in his arms. The boy had bright, curious eyes. "That's you," James said, following Lucas's gaze. His voice was tender, tinged with nostalgia. "And your mother?" Lucas stared at the photo for a long moment, then looked away, his face unreadable. "I don't remember her," he admitted, his voice low. James felt a pang of sadness. "She was kind, and she loved you very much," he said softly. "We both did." Lucas remained silent, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps a longing for a past he couldn't recall. The silence between them was heavy, filled with all the years they had lost. "Are you hungry?" James asked, trying to ease the tension. Lucas nodded hesitantly. "A little." James headed to the kitchen and started preparing a simple meal, spaghetti, one of Daniel's favorites from the past. He hoped that the familiar routine of dinner might bring some comfort. Lucas sat at the kitchen table, watching James with a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. "You cook?" Lucas asked, sounding genuinely surprised. James chuckled. "I had to learn," he said. "There were times I thought you'd come back, and I wanted to be ready, to be a good father again, if I ever got the chance." Lucas shifted uncomfortably, not knowing how to respond. The idea of someone preparing for him, waiting for him, was foreign. "It smells good," he offered after a moment. "Thanks," James replied, trying to keep the mood light. "It's not fancy, but it's better than shelter food, I hope." Lucas managed a small smile. "Yeah, it's definitely better." As they ate, the awkwardness slowly began to lift. Lucas asked questions about the house, about the neighborhood, and about James's life over the years. James answered as openly as he could, carefully navigating through the painful memories. He told Lucas about the failed searches, the sleepless nights, and the constant ache of not knowing where his son was. "I never stopped hoping," James said, his voice breaking slightly, "even when it seemed impossible." Lucas looked down at his plate, his voice barely audible. "I didn't think anyone was looking for me." James reached across the table, placing a hand over Lucas's. "I never gave up on you," he said firmly. "Not for a single day." Lucas's eyes were filled with a mix of emotions, gratitude, confusion, and a lingering sense of disbelief. "It's just hard to believe," he admitted. "I know," James replied, "but we have time. We'll take it slow." The following days were a strange blend of routine and adjustment. Lucas explored the house, finding small things that sparked faint memories. He discovered an old box of toys in the attic, mostly dusty action figures and a small, worn-out soccer ball. He picked up the ball, turning it over in his hands. "You love that ball," James said from the doorway, startling Lucas. "You used to kick it around the living room." Even though your mother always told you not to? Lucas laughed lightly, a sound that seemed to surprise even himself. I guess some things never change, he said, a hint of playfulness in his voice. James's heart warmed at the sound of Lucas's laughter. Maybe we can play outside sometime, he suggested, trying to create new memories to build on the old ones. Yeah, Lucas agreed, though there was still a note of caution in his tone. One night, as they sat in the living room watching a movie, Lucas suddenly asked, "Do you think it's okay for me to call you Dad?" The question hit James like a bolt of lightning, unexpected, powerful, and filled with meaning. He felt tears welling up, but he kept his voice steady. "I'd like that," he said softly. "Whenever you're ready." Lucas nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "It feels weird," he admitted, "but I want to try." "Take your time," James reassured him. "We have all the time we need now." Lucas leaned back into the couch, a small sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere. But their newfound stability was soon threatened. One afternoon, as James was preparing dinner, he received a call from Nancy, the child services worker. Her voice was tense, urgent. "Mr. Warren, we have a problem," she said. "There's someone from Lucas's past, a man named Rick Taylor, who's claiming to be his guardian. He's demanding custody." James's heart sank. "Who is he?" he asked, his voice barely steady. "He's listed as a former foster parent," Nancy explained. "But his record is troubling. We're investigating, but he's filed a legal claim. You'll need to prepare for a potential custody battle." James felt a surge of panic. He had just found Lucas, and now there was a risk of losing him again. "What can I do?" he asked urgently. "Get a lawyer," Nancy advised, "and be prepared. It's going to be a fight." When James hung up, his hands were trembling. He turned to find Lucas standing in the doorway, a look of fear in his eyes. "Who was that?" Lucas asked, sensing the tension. James hesitated, then spoke honestly. "It was Nancy. Someone from your past is trying to take you back." Lucas's face went pale. "Rick," he muttered, a mixture of fear and anger in his voice. "Do you know him?" James asked carefully. Lucas nodded, his expression darkening. "He was one of my foster parents." "He's not a good man." James stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on Lucas's shoulder. "I won't let him take you," he said firmly. "We'll fight this together." Lucas looked up, a mix of hope and fear in his eyes. "You promise?" "I promise," James said, his voice filled with determination. The days that followed were filled with meetings, legal consultations, and tense conversations. Lucas struggled with the idea that his past was coming back to claim him. At times, he seemed almost resigned, as if he expected things to fall apart. But James remained unwavering, assuring Lucas that they would fight for their family, no matter what. One night, as they sat together in the dimly lit kitchen, Lucas asked, "What if he wins?" James looked into Lucas's eyes, his voice filled with conviction. "He won't," he said, "because we're stronger together. And no one's taking you away from me again." Lucas's eyes were glassy with unshed tears. "I want to stay," he said, his voice cracking. "And you will," James promised, pulling Lucas into a tight embrace. "You're home now, and nothing's going to change that." The battle was just beginning, but for the first time, Lucas felt that he wasn't facing it alone. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and unexpected turns, but James and Lucas were ready to face it, together, as father and son. The custody battle loomed over James and Lucas like a dark cloud. The mornings were filled with meetings with lawyers, discussions about legal strategies, and attempts to gather evidence that could disprove Rick Taylor's claim. James was relentless in his determination to keep Lucas, but he was also exhausted. Each day brought a new set of challenges, and the fear of losing Lucas seemed to grow stronger with every passing hour. Lucas, meanwhile, was battling his own fears. The idea of being taken away from James and thrust back into the chaos of the foster system left him in a state of constant anxiety. He barely slept, and when he did, his dreams were often filled with haunting memories of Rick, a rough, domineering figure whose voice still echoed in Lucas's mind. One evening, Lucas found James sitting alone in the living room, staring blankly at a pile of legal documents. The exhaustion was evident on James's face, but there was also a determined fire in his eyes. "I'm not going back to him," Lucas said suddenly, breaking the silence. James looked up, startled by the intensity in Lucas's voice. "You won't have to," he replied firmly. "I'll make sure of it." Lucas sat down next to James, his expression serious. "Rick, he's not just a bad foster parent. He's dangerous," he confessed, his voice low. James's heart sank at the words. "What did he do?" he asked gently, dreading the answer. Lucas hesitated, clearly struggling to put his experiences into words. "He used to make me do things I didn't want to do," he said quietly. "If I didn't listen, he'd lock me in a small room. Sometimes for days." James felt a surge of anger and helplessness. He wanted to protect Lucas from those painful memories, but he also knew that Lucas needed to be heard. "I'm sorry," James said softly. "I should have found you sooner." Lucas shook his head. His eyes filled with a mix of sadness and acceptance. "It wasn't your fault," he said. "But I need you to promise me something." "Anything," James replied instantly. "Promise me that you won't let him win," Lucas said, his voice raw with desperation. James reached out, placing a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "I promise," he said. "No matter what, I won't let him take you." The next few days were filled with tense preparations for the upcoming court hearing. James's lawyer, a stern but compassionate woman named Claire, worked tirelessly to build a case that would discredit Rick's claim. She urged James and Lucas to remain strong, reminding them that the law was on their side. But James knew that the legal system wasn't always fair, especially when it came to children in the foster system. "It's not just about the evidence," Claire warned one afternoon. "It's about convincing the judge that you are the better guardian for Lucas." James nodded, his determination unwavering. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. The day of the hearing arrived faster than either James or Lucas had anticipated. They both woke up early, the tension palpable in the air. Lucas was unusually quiet, his eyes clouded with fear and uncertainty. "Are you ready?" James asked as they prepared to leave for the courthouse. Lucas hesitated, then nodded slowly. "As ready as I'll ever be," he said. When they arrived at the courthouse, the atmosphere was overwhelming. Lawyers, social workers, and foster children filled the hallways, each one fighting their own battles. Lucas clung to James's side, his hands clenched into fists. Inside the courtroom, Rick Taylor sat with his lawyer, a slick-looking man with a confident demeanor. Rick was as Lucas had described, tall, with a rough exterior and a menacing presence. He shot Lucas a cold, almost triumphant look as they entered, making Lucas visibly tense. James noticed and leaned down, whispering, "Don't be afraid. He can't hurt you here." Lucas nodded, but the fear in his eyes remained. The hearing began with formal introductions and legal jargon that seemed to blur together. Then came the testimonies. Rick's lawyer painted a picture of Rick as a well-meaning foster parent who had simply lost track of Lucas due to misunderstandings. Rick himself spoke, his voice filled with false sincerity. He claimed that he had always tried to do what was best for Lucas, describing himself as a misunderstood guardian who only wanted to give the boy a second chance. Lucas clenched his jaw, his anger barely contained. "He's lying," he whispered to James. "I know," James whispered back, "but we'll tell the truth." When it was Lucas's turn to speak, he hesitated at first, his gaze fixed on the ground. James watched him with a mix of pride and heartbreak, knowing how hard it was for Lucas to relive the trauma. "Lucas," the judge prompted gently, "you're here today to tell us about your time with Mr. Taylor. You can take your time." Lucas finally looked up, his voice trembling but steady. "Rick wasn't a good foster parent," he began, his eyes locking with the judge's. "He used to hurt me. He locked me in small rooms when I didn't do what he wanted. I was always scared." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of Lucas's words sinking in. "I ran away because I was afraid he'd kill me one day," Lucas continued, his voice cracking. "I never felt safe until I met James." James's heart swelled with emotion. He wanted to run to Lucas, to hold him, but he knew he needed to stay composed. "Thank you, Lucas," the judge said, her voice filled with compassion. "Is there anything else you'd like to add?" Lucas hesitated, then looked at James. His eyes filled with a mixture of vulnerability and hope. "I just want to stay with him," he said. "He's my dad." James could barely hold back his tears, overwhelmed by the simple but powerful statement. Next, it was James's turn to testify. He spoke with sincerity and passion, describing the search for his son, the years of despair, and the moment he found Lucas. He explained the bond they had built, emphasizing that Lucas was now his family, in every sense of the word. "I've made mistakes in my life," James admitted, his voice steady. "But finding Lucas wasn't one of them. He is my son, and I will do whatever it takes to protect him." The judge listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. When James finished, she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Warren," she said. As the hearing came to an end, the judge announced that she would need time to review the evidence and make a decision. The waiting game began once again, but this time, there was a sense of finality in the air. One way or another, Lucas's future would be decided. Outside the courthouse, Lucas seemed both relieved and terrified. "What if she doesn't believe us?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. James crouched down to Lucas's level, looking him straight in the eyes. "She will," he said with confidence. "We told the truth, and that's all we can do." Lucas nodded, but the fear lingered. The following week was agonizing. James and Lucas tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but the uncertainty hung over them like a storm cloud. Then, one afternoon, the call came. Claire's voice was calm, but there was a hint of excitement in her tone. "James, we've won. The judge ruled in your favor. Lucas stays with you." James felt a surge of relief so powerful that he nearly collapsed. "Thank you," he managed to say, tears of joy welling up. When he turned to Lucas, he could barely contain his emotions. "Lucas," he said, his voice breaking, "you're staying. You're home." Lucas's face broke into a wide smile, one filled with joy, relief, and a sense of belonging he had never felt before. He ran into James's arms, holding on tightly. "I knew you'd keep your promise," Lucas whispered, tears streaming down his face. James held him close, his heart full of love and gratitude. "And I always will," he said. "No one's taking you away ever again." They stood there for a long time, savoring the victory they had fought so hard for. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but for now, they were together, truly, finally, and without the shadow of separation hanging over them. The days following the court victory felt surreal to both James and Lucas. After months of uncertainty, fear, and the looming threat of separation, the final decision had lifted a heavy burden from their hearts. But while the legal battle was over, the real work of building a life together had just begun. James knew that winning custody was only the first step. Healing the deep wounds from Lucas's past would take much longer. One morning, James found Lucas sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a bowl of cereal. "You okay, kiddo?" James asked, keeping his tone light. Lucas looked up, his eyes distant. "Yeah, just thinking." James pulled up a chair beside him. "Want to talk about it?" Lucas hesitated, then shrugged. "I don't know how to be normal," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know what a normal family is supposed to feel like." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get that," he said gently, "but maybe we don't need to be normal. We just need to be us." Lucas managed a small smile. "What does that even mean?" "It means we figure it out as we go," James replied. "We make our own kind of normal." Lucas seemed to consider this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "I think I can try that." In the following weeks, the two of them worked on establishing a new routine. James enrolled Lucas in a local school, a step that was both exciting and daunting for the boy. Lucas hadn't attended school regularly in years, and the idea of fitting in with a new group of kids made him anxious. On the first day of school, Lucas stood by the front door, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "What if they don't like me?" he asked nervously. James knelt down, making sure he was eye level with Lucas. "Just be yourself," he said. "And if anyone gives you a hard time, you let me know. We'll figure it out together." Lucas nodded, his face a mix of determination and fear. "Okay, I'll try." The school was bustling with activity when they arrived. Kids ran across the playground, laughing and shouting as parents watched from the sidelines. Lucas took a deep breath, his grip on his backpack tightening. "You've got this," James reassured him, giving Lucas's shoulder a gentle squeeze. Lucas nodded, then turned to face the school building. "I'll be okay," he said, as much to himself as to James. The first few days were rough. Lucas struggled to adjust, often returning home tired and withdrawn. But as the weeks passed, he slowly began to make friends. He even found a shared interest with some of the other boys' soccer. One afternoon, Lucas excitedly told James about scoring a goal during recess. "I was the hero of the game," he said, his eyes shining with a mixture of pride and disbelief. James's heart swelled with happiness. "I always knew you had it in you," he said, ruffling Lucas's hair playfully. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. They spent their evenings cooking dinner together, watching movies, or playing board games at the kitchen table. Sometimes, they would even head to the local park and kick the worn-out soccer ball around, just like James and Daniel had done years before. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, Lucas turned to James with a serious expression. "Do you think my mom would have been proud of me?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. James felt a lump in his throat, but he answered honestly. "She would have been incredibly proud," he said. "She always wanted you to be happy and safe. And I think she's smiling down on you right now." Lucas nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and hope. "I wish I could remember her," he said quietly. James placed a reassuring hand on Lucas's shoulder. "You may not remember her, but a part of her is always with you," he said. "And I'll tell you as many stories as you want to hear." Lucas managed a small smile. "I'd like that," he said. But their fragile sense of peace was soon interrupted by an unexpected threat. One afternoon, James received a call from Claire, their lawyer. Her voice was tense, filled with urgency. "James, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we have a situation," she said. "It's about Rick." James's heart sank. "What now?" he asked, bracing himself. "He's appealing the custody decision," Claire explained. "He's claiming that the original ruling was unfair, and he's trying to reopen the case." James felt a surge of anger and frustration. "How is that even possible?" he demanded. "It's legal, but not easy," Claire said. "We have a good chance of blocking the appeal, but we need to act quickly." James's mind raced. The thought of losing Lucas again was unbearable. "What do I need to do?" he asked, his voice filled with determination. "We'll need to gather more evidence of your bond with Lucas," Claire replied. "Witnesses, teachers, neighbors, anyone who can testify that Lucas is thriving in your care." James agreed to everything, his resolve unshakable. But he knew that the news would devastate Lucas, and he dreaded telling him. That evening, James sat Lucas down at the kitchen table. "We need to talk," he said gently. Lucas's face immediately darkened, sensing that something was wrong. "What is it?" he asked warily. James took a deep breath. "Rick is trying to appeal the court's decision," he explained. "It means we have to fight again." Lucas's eyes widened with fear. "But we won," he said, his voice shaky. "I know," James said, trying to stay calm. "And we can win again. But it's going to be tough." Lucas looked down, his shoulders slumping with defeat. "Why won't he just leave us alone?" he asked, his voice filled with frustration. James reached out, placing a comforting hand on Lucas's. "Because he's a bully," he said, "but we're stronger than he is. And this time, we have more people on our side." Lucas looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I don't want to go back," he said quietly. "I want to stay here. With you." "You will," James promised. "We'll fight this together, just like before." The following days were a blur of meetings, affidavits, and preparation. Lucas's teachers, the staff at the shelter, and even a few neighbors agreed to testify on James's behalf, describing the transformation they had seen in Lucas since moving in with James. The support was overwhelming, and it gave both James and Lucas a renewed sense of hope. The day of the appeal hearing arrived, bringing with it a wave of tension and anxiety. Lucas clung to James's side as they entered the courthouse, his face pale but determined. Inside the courtroom, Rick was there, looking as confident and menacing as ever. But this time, Lucas was not afraid. He stood tall, ready to tell his story once again. When it was Lucas's turn to speak, he stepped forward, his voice steady despite the fear that still lingered. "I've been through a lot," he began. "But being with James has been the best thing that's ever happened to me. I feel safe, loved, and happy, and I don't want to lose that." James's eyes filled with tears, his heart swelling with pride. Lucas had come so far, and he was fighting not just for himself, but for the family they had built together. After hours of testimonies and arguments, the judge finally made her decision. She ruled in favor of James, denying Rick's appeal and reaffirming the original custody ruling. As soon as the judge announced her decision, Lucas ran into James's arms, his relief palpable. "We did it," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Yes, we did," James replied, holding Lucas tightly. "And we always will." For the first time, their future felt secure. A new chapter had begun, one filled with promise, healing, and the kind of love that could withstand anything. The days following the appeal victory were filled with a quiet joy. There were no more legal battles, no looming threats. For the first time since they had found each other, James and Lucas could focus on building a real, stable life together. But while the legal struggle was over, the process of healing was still ongoing. One afternoon, as Lucas returned from school, he was met by the sight of James cooking in the kitchen. The aroma of baked chicken filled the air, and Lucas's face lit up. "What's the occasion?" he asked, setting his backpack down. James turned, smiling warmly. "No occasion," he said. "I just thought we deserved a nice dinner." Lucas nodded, trying to act casual, but there was a hint of excitement in his eyes. "Can I help?" "Of course," James replied. "How about you peel the potatoes?" Lucas joined James at the counter, grabbing a potato and a peeler. As they worked side by side, the kitchen was filled with a comfortable silence. It was moments like these, simple, mundane moments, that meant the most to both of them. There was a sense of normalcy, something that Lucas had longed for but never truly experienced. As they sat down to eat, Lucas looked across the table at James, his expression serious. "I don't know how to say this, but thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." James felt a lump in his throat, but he managed a warm smile. "You don't have to thank me," he said gently. "You're my son. This is where you belong." Lucas looked down at his plate, a shy smile forming on his face. "It still feels weird sometimes," he admitted. "Like I'm not used to it." "That's okay," James reassured him. "It'll take time. We're both learning." Over the next few weeks, Lucas began to settle into his new life with more confidence. He made more friends at school, got involved in a soccer league, and even started doing better in his classes. He still had moments of doubt, flashes of his past that made him anxious, but they were becoming less frequent. And whenever the past seemed to creep up on him, James was always there, steady, supportive, and unconditionally loving. One Saturday morning, as they were having breakfast, Lucas turned to James with a sudden question. "Can we visit my mother's grave?" he asked. James was taken aback, but he nodded without hesitation. "Of course," he said. "Whenever you're ready." "I think I'm ready now," Lucas replied. The drive to the cemetery was quiet, filled with a sense of anticipation and solemnity. James hadn't been there in years. He had always found it too painful. But now, with Lucas by his side, it felt different. It felt like closure. When they arrived, Lucas seemed unsure of what to do. He stood by the grave, his eyes fixed on the headstone, which was etched with simple words. Emily Warren, beloved wife and mother. James placed a gentle hand on Lucas's shoulder. "You can say whatever you want, or nothing at all," he said softly. Lucas nodded, then stepped closer. He stared at the headstone for a long moment before speaking, his voice barely audible. "Hi, Mom," he began. "I'm sorry I don't remember you, but Dad told me about you. He said you were kind and that you loved me." James watched quietly, his heart aching with both sadness and pride. Lucas continued, his voice stronger now. "I just wanted to say that I'm okay. Dad takes good care of me, and I think you'd be proud." There was a long pause, then Lucas turned to James, tears brimming in his eyes. "Do you think she can hear me?" James nodded, his own eyes wet. "I do," he said. "And I know she's proud of you." Lucas reached out and hugged James tightly. "I miss her," he whispered. "I miss her too," James replied, holding Lucas close. "But we're here, and we have each other." After that day, something shifted in Lucas. It was as if he had finally allowed himself to grieve, not just for his mother, but for all the lost years, the confusion, and the pain. And in that grief, he found a new sense of peace. The following week, Lucas came home with a project from school. It was a family tree assignment, something that once would have felt impossible for him to complete. But now, he seemed eager. "Can you help me with this?" he asked, holding up the assignment. James smiled warmly. "I'd love to," he said. They sat at the kitchen table, sketching out the branches of their family. James helped Lucas fill in the names, telling him stories about each person as they went along. Lucas listened intently, absorbing every detail. "Do you think we can add more branches one day?" Lucas asked suddenly. "Like, if we adopt more kids?" James was surprised by the question, but he answered with sincerity. "I'd like that," he said. "And I think you'd be a great big brother." Lucas grinned. "I think so too," he said confidently. As the days turned into months, Lucas continued to thrive. He became more open, more expressive, and his laughter became a constant presence in the house. There were still challenges, of course. Nights when old nightmares returned, or days when school felt overwhelming. But James was always there to guide him through. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, Lucas turned to James with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about the future?" he asked. James nodded. "All the time," he said. "I think about the kind of man you'll become and all the things you'll achieve." Lucas seemed to consider this. "I want to make you proud," he said quietly. "You already do," James replied without hesitation. Lucas looked up, his eyes filled with a new sense of purpose. "I want to help other kids too," he said. "Kids who don't have a family." James felt a surge of pride. "That's a wonderful goal," he said. "And I'll help you however I can." Lucas's face lit up with determination. "We can start by helping the shelter," he suggested. "Maybe we can volunteer together." James smiled, his heart full. "I'd like that," he said. "We'll make a difference, one step at a time." From that day forward, James and Lucas began volunteering regularly at the shelter where they had first met. It became a shared mission, a way for them to give back and to help others find the hope that they had found in each other. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day, rooted in trust, love, and the promise of a better future. And as they walked the path of life together, they knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side, father and son, family at last. The months turned into a year, and Lucas had grown more comfortable in his new life with James. He was no longer the fearful, guarded boy who had arrived at the shelter. Now, he was confident, curious, and filled with a newfound sense of belonging. He excelled in school, made lasting friendships, and continued to volunteer alongside James at the shelter that had once been his refuge. For James, seeing Lucas thrive was a dream come true, a testament to the power of love and second chances. One warm spring afternoon, they decided to take a drive to a nearby beach, a place James had often gone with Lucas's mother when they were young. It was a spot James had avoided for years, too burdened by memories of what was lost. But now, with Lucas beside him, it felt like the right time to revisit the past and embrace the future. As they parked near the shore, Lucas's face lit up with excitement. "Wow, it's huge!" he exclaimed, his eyes wide with wonder as he took in the vast expanse of the ocean. James smiled, feeling a sense of warmth spread through him. "It's a special place," he said. "Your mom and I used to come here before you were born. We always talked about bringing you here one day." Lucas looked up at James, his expression thoughtful. "I'm glad we're here now," he said sincerely. They spent the afternoon walking along the sandy shore, collecting seashells and feeling the cool waves lap at their feet. Lucas ran ahead at times, splashing in the water and laughing freely. James watched him, his heart swelling with gratitude. This was the life he had longed for, the chance to see his son happy, safe, and filled with joy. As the sun began to set, casting a warm orange glow across the water, They sat down on a weathered piece of driftwood. Lucas was quiet for a moment, gazing out at the horizon. "Dad," he said suddenly, the word rolling off his tongue naturally now. "I think I finally understand what family really means." James turned to Lucas, his eyes filled with affection. "What does it mean to you?" he asked gently. Lucas thought for a moment, then spoke with a mix of clarity and emotion. "It means having someone who won't leave you," he said. "Someone who stays, even when things get hard." James felt tears welling up in his eyes, but they were tears of happiness this time. "You're right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I promise, I'm here for good, no matter what." Lucas nodded, a small but genuine smile forming on his face. "I believe you," he said quietly, "and I'm glad you found me." The next few weeks were filled with a sense of contentment that neither of them had ever experienced before. Lucas was more open about his past, sharing stories of his time in foster care, his struggles on the streets, and even some of the darker moments he had endured. It wasn't always easy for James to hear, but he listened without judgment, offering support and reassurance. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Lucas handed James a small notebook. "What's this?" James asked, flipping through the pages filled with scribbled notes and drawings. "It's a journal," Lucas explained, a hint of shyness in his voice. "I started writing in it when I first came to live with you. It helped me make sense of things." James looked at the entries, some dated from their early days together. There were descriptions of Lucas's fears, hopes, and moments of trust slowly taking root. "This is incredible," James said, his voice filled with pride. Lucas seemed relieved by James's reaction. "I wanted you to read it," he said, "so you can understand me better." James felt a surge of love for Lucas, a love that had grown deeper with every challenge they had faced. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "It means a lot that you'd share this with me." Lucas smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. "You're the reason I wrote it," he said. "You made me believe that things could be different." A few weeks later, James and Lucas received a letter from the state's adoption agency. The letter confirmed that their adoption process, which had begun months earlier, was now complete. Lucas was officially and legally James's son. When James shared the news, Lucas's reaction was immediate. He ran into James's arms, holding him tightly. "I'm really your son now," he said, his voice filled with a mix of joy and relief. "You've always been my son," James replied, his voice breaking. "But now it's on paper, too." The day of the official adoption ceremony was filled with emotion. Friends from the shelter, Lucas's teachers, and even a few neighbors gathered at the courthouse to celebrate. As the judge read the final decree, James and Lucas stood hand in hand, their smiles reflecting a sense of triumph. Afterward, there was a small celebration at their home. Lucas was surrounded by people who cared for him, and for the first time in his life, he felt completely safe and loved. "Are you happy?" James asked later that evening, as they stood on the porch watching the stars come out. Lucas turned to James, his eyes bright with emotion. "More than happy," he said. "I feel whole." James felt his heart swell with a mixture of pride and love. "So do I," he said softly. In the weeks that followed, Lucas continued to thrive. He started a new hobby, painting, and his room soon filled with colorful canvases depicting everything from sunsets to abstract representations of his feelings. It became a way for him to express himself, to channel the emotions he had once kept locked away. James encouraged Lucas's creativity, often joining him in the makeshift studio they set up in the garage. It was a time for bonding, laughter, and shared inspiration. One evening, as they were cleaning up after a painting session, Lucas suddenly turned to James. "Do you ever think about Mom?" he asked, his voice soft but curious. James paused, then nodded. "I think about her every day," he admitted. "But now, it's not as painful. It's more like remembering the good times." Lucas seemed to consider this. "Do you think she'd like me?" he asked. James's eyes softened. "She would have loved you," he said sincerely. "She always wanted a strong, brave son. And that's exactly who you are." Lucas's face lit up with a smile. "I'm glad," he said simply. As the months continued to pass, the once broken pieces of Lucas's life were gradually being rebuilt. this time with a foundation of love, trust, and unwavering support. The bond between him and James grew stronger, shaped by shared experiences, heartfelt conversations, and the knowledge that they had found each other against all odds. One day, as they stood on a hill overlooking the city, Lucas turned to James with a wide grin. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with a sense of victory. James smiled back, his heart full. "Yes, we did," he said. "And this is just the beginning." Lucas nodded, his eyes filled with hope and determination. "I know," he said. "We have a lot of adventures ahead." They stood there for a moment longer, side by side, father and son, looking toward a future that was bright and full of promise. Whatever came next, they were ready, because they had each other, and that was all they needed.